For weeks, South Gyeongsang province in South Korea was stuck in a drought. Reservoirs were low. Farmers were worried. Then, over a single weekend, the sky did the exact opposite of everything it had been doing for a month. Geoje City recorded more than 800 millimeters of rain in roughly 48 hours, part of a cumulative total that climbed past 900 millimeters. A landslide tore into the ground floor of an apartment building before dawn on Monday. 12 schools flooded. 2 of South Korea's biggest shipbuilding companies sent their employees home. Here's the part almost nobody is talking about. This wasn't a slow, gradually worsening storm. It was one of the most extreme and abrupt drought-to-flood reversals this region has seen in years, and understanding why it happened tells you something important about how modern weather extremes actually work. No guessing, no dramatizing, just the facts, the science, and the real stakes. Let's get into it. The rain, a number that's hard to picture. Rainfall. Totals like this are difficult to grasp in the abstract, so it's worth being specific. Between Saturday and Monday morning, Geoje City in South Gyeongsang province recorded 805.7 millimeters of rain, and by the time the heaviest activity passed, the cumulative total for the event had climbed to roughly 912 millimeters. The neighboring city of Tongyeong recorded 671.9 millimeters over the same stretch. To put that in perspective, that's not far off from the entire annual rainfall many temperate regions of the world receive across all 12 months, compressed instead into roughly 48 hours. The Korea Herald summed up the scale of it plainly. South Gyeongsang province had effectively received an entire summer's worth of rainfall in just 2 days. What makes that even more striking is what preceded it. The region had been experiencing a genuine multi-week drought right up until this rain arrived. The kind of dry stretch that has farmers and water utilities watching reservoir levels with real concern. The transition from not enough water to catastrophically too much water happened, essentially, over a single weekend. The landslide. A building engulfed before dawn. The most dangerous single incident during the flooding happened just after 4:30 in the morning on Monday, in the Okpo-dong area of Geoje. A landslide, triggered by the saturated hillside above, engulfed the ground floor of an apartment building. Rescue crews pulled 3 people from the building. One of them, found in cardiac arrest, was rushed to a hospital but later died. A separate landslide struck in nearby Tongyeong, where rescue teams pulled 1 additional person to safety. Local emergency services describe both incidents as happening with very little warning, consistent with how landslides triggered by prolonged extreme saturation tend to behave. The ground holds until it simply doesn't, and by the time visible signs of instability appear, there's often very little time left to react. The disruption. Schools, shipyards, and a region grinding to a halt. Beyond the landslides, the flooding disrupted daily life across the province in ways that touched a huge cross-section of the local economy and community. At least 12 schools and kindergartens experienced flooding, severe enough to affect operations. Transportation services across the region were suspended as roads became impassable and public transit routes were affected by high water. The economic impact reached some of South Korea's most significant industrial employers, Samsung Heavy Industries and Hanwha Ocean, 2 of the country's largest shipbuilding companies, both major employers in the Geoje area, given the region's importance to South Korea's shipbuilding industry, allowed employees to work from home rather than commute through the flooded conditions. For a region where these companies represent a substantial share of local employment, that's a meaningful signal of just how severe the disruption was, not a minor precaution, but an acknowledgement that normal commuting simply wasn't safe or feasible. It's a genuinely reasonable question. How does a region go from weeks of drought to receiving nearly a year's worth of rain in 48 hours? The short answer involves both. Atmospheric setup and a feature of extreme rainfall events that's becoming increasingly well documented around the world. Droughts are typically caused by a persistent weather pattern, often a stable high-pressure system, that blocks rain-producing weather systems from reaching a region for an extended stretch. When that blocking pattern finally breaks down, and particularly when it's replaced by a moisture-rich system moving in from a warm ocean surface, the atmosphere can release an enormous amount of built-up moisture very quickly, especially if that system stalls or moves slowly over one area rather than passing through. There's also a well-documented physical relationship at play that meteorologists refer to when explaining increasingly extreme rainfall events globally. Warmer air holds significantly more water vapor than cooler air. As sea surface temperatures and overall atmospheric temperatures rise, weather systems that do form have more available moisture to release when they finally do produce rain, meaning that when a drought does break, it's increasingly likely to break not gently, but explosively, dumping in days what might once have fallen more gradually across weeks. South Korea, surrounded by ocean and on a Three sides and sitting downstream of some genuinely warm late summer sea surface temperatures, is particularly exposed to exactly this kind of abrupt, moisture-loaded rainfall event. Why landslides follow droughts, not just storms? There's a specific, somewhat counterintuitive detail worth explaining here. A landslide following a drought-breaking deluge can, in some ways, be even more dangerous than one following a typical rainy season because of how dry soil behaves when it's suddenly saturated. During an extended drought, soil dries out and can develop cracks and reduce structural cohesion at a microscopic level. When intense rain suddenly arrives after this kind of prolonged dry spell, water can penetrate those cracks and channels far more rapidly than it would into soil that's been consistently moderately moist all season. That faster penetration means the soil's internal water pressure can build unusually quickly, sometimes catching both residents and even monitoring systems off guard, because the transition from dry and stable looking to critically saturated and failing can happen over a matter of hours, rather than the more gradual days-long process typically associated with landslide risk during a normal rainy season. The wider pattern. An increasingly volatile climate for the Korean Peninsula. This event doesn't exist in isolation from South Korea's broader recent climate trends. The Korean Peninsula has experienced a series of increasingly volatile weather extremes in recent years, including record-breaking heat waves, like the 42.5 degrees Celsius temperature recorded in Gyeongsang just weeks before this flooding event, alongside increasingly intense, short-duration rainfall events like the one that just hit Geoje. Climate researchers studying East Asia's monsoon and broader precipitation patterns have pointed to a growing tendency toward this kind of whiplash weather, extended dry periods punctuated by unusually intense, compressed bursts of rain, rather than the more evenly distributed rainy seasons the region's infrastructure and agriculture were historically designed around. That shift creates a genuinely difficult planning problem. Water management systems built to handle either steady drought or steady rainfall are increasingly being asked to handle both extremes, sometimes within the same month. Local authorities in Geoje and Tongyeong continue assessing the full scope of the damage, including ongoing monitoring of other slopes in the region that may have been similarly weakened by the extreme rainfall, even in areas that haven't yet failed. Schools affected by flooding are expected to require cleanup and repair before fully resuming normal operations, and transportation. Services are being gradually restored as floodwaters recede. Samsung Heavy Industries and Hanwha Ocean have not indicated a specific date for a full return to in-person operations, with the decision likely depending on continued monitoring of local conditions and remaining flood risk. South Korea's weather agency will be watching closely to see whether this event represents an isolated extreme or the start of a more sustained pattern of heavy rain for the remainder of the season, particularly given how abruptly this rainfall followed weeks of drought conditions across the same province. A few weeks ago, the story in South Gyeongsang province was about not having enough water. This week, it's about having far too much, all at once, delivered with enough force to bring down part of a building before sunrise. That whiplash, drought to catastrophic flood in a matter of days, isn't just a strange coincidence of timing. It's an increasingly familiar signature of how extreme weather is behaving in a warming world. Less gradual, more sudden, and considerably harder for any single community or any single set of drainage systems and hillsides to fully prepare for in advance. Subscribe so you don't miss the next update on this story. Leave that comment below. Has your region ever swung suddenly between drought and flooding like this? 5,000 likes on this one? Let's go. See you in the next one.